In this video, we will go through the topic of biodiversity. We'll first start with a definition for biodiversity. So this is the number and variety of life forms, including species, found within a specific region. Part of biodiversity also includes the variety of Earth's ecosystems. In order for biodiversity to remain high, diverse ecosystems need to remain sustainable. Preserving and protecting individual species and the ecosystems they inhabit are critical for maintaining biodiversity on Earth. So, how many species are there on Earth? So far, scientists have identified about 2 million species. However, the estimate that the total numbers of species on Earth is somewhere between 5 to 10 million species. So, there's a lot of species out there yet to be discovered. Why is biodiversity so important? The variety of life on Earth is essential to sustaining the living systems we depend on for health, wealth, food, and other natural services. These include natural services, economics, and the natural resources such as lumber, agriculture, crops, and clothing, and medicines. So, out of the top 150 prescription drugs, 118 originally came from living creatures, mostly plants. The prime example of that is that of aspirin, which has the compound acetylsalic acid. Acetylsalic acid is found in the bark of willow trees, and chewing on bark used to help relieve headaches. It was later found that the compound that does this is that acetylsalic acid, which is now artificially or synthesized without actually having to grind up a tree. And so, how do scientists measure biodiversity? They can use a technique called canopy fogging, and this is usually used to sample insects. So, trees are sprayed with insecticides. Those insecticides will kill whatever is up in the trees, and then whatever's up in the trees should fall out from the trees and then caught in a net, shown here, down below on the ground. So you have these scientists with these giant machines that go and spray insecticide, they fog the trees, and then whatever comes out, they measure and count. Another technique is one called quadrant sampling, so get rid of that N in your note. This is where an area is marked with a square made of plastic stakes, and different species are counted within their quadrant. So a quadrant basically is a section of an ecosystem, usually a very small section that is staked off, and then the species on the inside are counted. And then so this can allow for sampling of a large area. So for example, if this green area here is the ecosystem, the quadrants would be placed at random positions in that ecosystem and the species within it counted. Netting is another technique for measuring biodiversity. So a fine net can be used to collect birds, insects, bat, and aquatic organisms. Once captured, they are identified and then released. There are hotspots of biodiversity throughout the world, and a hotspot is a place where there's an exceptionally large number of species in a small area. Some examples include in Ontario, the Carolinian forests in southwestern Ontario. In this picture here, this shows the red area here shows the Carolinian forests and how far they span in this area. Although these areas make up less than 1% of Canada's landmass, it has the highest number of species than any other in Canada. Most hotspots for biodiversity are in the tropics and coral reefs. And so this map here just shows where we find other hotspots for biodiversity in the world. So, one big area is in the rainforest, and then other locations include parts of Africa and Asia as well. Now, there are human impacts on biodiversity. Human activity has caused all levels of biodiversity to decrease at an unprecedented rate. The 5 major causes of this are habitat change, overexploitation, pollution, climate change, and invasive species. When we talk about habitat change, this is the process by which humans alter a habitat enough so that the native species can no longer live there. So when we talk about a native species, we are talking about a species that normally lives in a given habitat. So a species that you would find naturally within a given ecosystem. When a habitat changes, a species can move to a different habitat, or if it can't adapt to these changes, it will die, and population levels can drop dramatically. And so habitat changes can include things like dams. So the Hoover Dam, controls the flow of the Colorado River, and this has affected populations of fish. Habitat change can be classified into two major categories. There are natural sources of habitat destruction, such as volcanic eruptions, wildfires, droughts, and severe storms, such as hurricanes. Now, human activities that destroy habitats include deforestation, so clearing habitats for logging or other human uses. So you basically just clear cut a forested area, draining wetlands, which are drained for farming or for building homes, which can lead to potential flooding issues because those are generally floodplains if they're wetlands, and the damming of rivers, as we saw in the previous slide with that of the Colorado River. Habitat change may lead to habitat fragmentation, which is basically a patchwork of altered and original habitats. Overexploitation is another issue. This is the use of a resource faster than it can be replaced. Overexploitation can lead to extinction. So, for example, in Canada, cod in the Atlantic were fished close to extinction. This graph here shows cod harvested over more than 150 years or so. And this shows the fish catches in tons. And for a number of years, this was always kind of going up from the 1850s and would go up and go down and come up and go down. But in around the 1960s through the 1970s, there's just a dramatic increase in how much cod was being harvested from the Atlantic Ocean, and this caused a dramatic decrease in in the populations, and you can see this by how much fish was caught. That decreased and decreased until it's pretty low, and then around the 1990s, this is when fish catches dropped off to almost like nothing. There's almost like no fish to catch out in the Atlantic Ocean in terms of cod. And what's interesting here in this graphic, it kind of shows the size of the fish that were being caught. They were much larger fish to begin with, and as the much larger fish were caught, it was smaller and smaller fish, and those smaller fish basically weren't given a chance to reproduce, so they were being caught without replenishing the populations, and this is what led to that dramatic crash. Overuse of water is another factor. Fresh water is a precious resource. Keep in mind that Canada has the world's largest supply of fresh water. Now, this picture here can show what can happen to an area when there's overuse of water. So this is the Aral Sea in Central Asia, and rivers flowing to the lake were diverted for farming. Fish left the lake because the water levels dropped very low, and as a result, commercial fisheries had to close. So in 1989, you can see the size of the lake here. And then in 2008, because of all of the diverted water, the lake pretty much dried up, or the sea pretty much dried up. Pollution is another issue. So any substance added to the environment that produces a condition that is harmful to organisms. is considered pollution. So, for example, solid waste that cannot be recycled, carbon dioxide produced by automobiles are examples of pollution. Water can become polluted very easily. Pollution can enter water sources in different ways. There is point source pollution. This enters a body of water at a specific place from an identifiable source. So, for example, oil spills from tankers, or there is non-point source pollution. This is pollution that enters waters indirectly when it rains or snows. So, for example, fertilizer. This diagram here identifies the different ways in which pollution can enter into our water systems. So there's non-point sources. These are urban sources such as septic systems, so sewage water can be drained directly into water sources. There are agricultural non-point sources. So as mentioned in the slide, when fertilizer is applied and it rains or snows, this can wash fertilizer into close by streams or lakes, which can end up in larger bodies of water. Industrial areas can be point sources as well, as they can dump pollutants directly into bodies of water. Climate change also affects biodiversity, and by climate change, we talk about a change in the average temperature and rainfall in an area, and this is a change over time. If the climate in a given area changes too rapidly, the organisms may not be able to adapt to the change and may not survive. And so that is the end of this slideshow for biodiversity.